You are now tuned in to the Storm Tracker Podcast.
Welcome back, family, to the Storm Tracker Podcast. Marcus Benjamin here with my guy Frank Tucker, representing the Crib, South Florida. Together, we represent CanesCounty.com, part of the Rivals.com network. Make sure you subscribe to the website for free. Use the promo code Miami30. Also, subscribe to this YouTube channel. Like, share, and subscribe here at Live from Canes County. Plenty of news this week. It seemed like it was going to be like a quiet week when it started, but a lot of big news came out this week. You got Jamil Addae, who decides to take a job with the Buffalo Bills, leaving Miami. Alonzo Highsmith, the GM of Miami, also leaving for the NFL to the Patriots. And we may have a new running backs coach in Matt Merritt as well. Yesterday was National Signing Day. I think a lot of people don't even realize it even happened yesterday with the new early signing period in this new day of college football. So we'll talk a little bit about the 2024 class, how Miami closed out, and predictions for the 2025 class. But big news, man. Jamil Addae decides to go to the NFL. It was a surprise for me because this is a guy that was actively recruiting in the past couple of weeks. He was, of course, in Coral Gables, greeting and talking to a lot of different kids for their elite prospect day. But the NFL came calling, Frank. So what was your reaction when you heard the news?
I wasn't surprised. This is something that we've kind of heard rumblings about for a little over a year now. Since last offseason, there was the issue of, was he going to get a contract extension or not this offseason? Have things been solid on the cornerback front from a development standpoint with Coach Addae? Absolutely. I think he's one of the better coaches at the position from an on-field perspective. Now, if you look at how things were in recruiting-wise, he didn't do a great job, right? Since Ryan Mack, there wasn't a single cornerback that committed to the University of Miami. And that was for the majority of the second half of 2023, where you didn't have a single cornerback lock into the University of Miami. And I think Ryan Mack ended up being a steal for Miami, right? He's more of a three-star prospect and a legacy guy that I think wanted to go to Miami regardless of who the cornerbacks coach is. But if you look at how the position was recruited, it was kind of a failure in that regard, right? You missed out on Ellis Robinson. You missed out on Xavier Lucas. And that was two of the bigger targets at the position that they were focused on throughout the process. Anybody else that they really tried to go after that was a four-star prospect or higher really ended up not really thinking about Miami to that magnitude. So I think he kind of put all his eggs in that Ellis Robinson basket, and it didn't really work out in this past cycle. The cycle before that in 2023, they grabbed Damari Brown, but was Damari Brown a Jamil Addae addition? I don't know if he was, right? So overall, I don't necessarily know how great of a job he did as a recruiter. I know how great of a job he did as an on-field guy, but I think Miami was potentially looking for more at that cornerback position, and I think that, he was looking for opportunities outside of the University of Miami for the better half of a year. So for me, I think this was more of like a mutual separation that, was bound to happen at some point. He has bounced around a lot in college football, whether it was at West Virginia, whether it was at Georgia, whether it was at Miami in the last just few stops. But overall, I think that it was probably time for a change. It was a good year for him to kind of jump off of because of the development of Darryl Porter and Jaden Davis at the outside corner spots. Obviously, you got two safeties going in the draft. I don't necessarily know how much credit he gets for that just because Lance Guidry took the reins at the safety position in this last season. Overall, it was probably good for him to end up trying to make that move now, especially with the contract situation circling over his head. And I think that Miami's going to find a guy that fits what they're wanting from a recruiting standpoint and an on-field development standpoint.
Yeah, I got to agree with you as far as recruiting is concerned. There weren't any big home runs when it comes to the cornerback position. or even his involvement as far as safety is concerned. I mean, yeah, you do get a Zaquan Patterson, but that's a guy that you probably already thought was probably going to commit to Miami, regardless if Jamil Addae was there or not. But I think what you lose is a guy who develops guys. He does. I believe he gets some credit for developing a Daryl Porter Jr., who's really kind of elevated his game in the last 2 years. He's going to get some credit to develop Tyreek Stevenson, who's now balling out in the NFL, as well as developing a DJ Ivy in that last year, which was obviously his best year as a Miami Hurricane, enabling him to be drafted as well. So I think he wanted to be more just on the football side of things. You know, you can kind of see it with what he did at the University of Miami, because we just kind of said that he wasn't the best recruiter. He did, I think, a well enough job, but I think the way these other positions have been recruited here at Miami, it just seems like he is, one of those guys that weren't as good as a Kevin Beard or as a Jason Taylor or an Alex Mirabal or something like that. It's like he didn't really elevate the level of recruiting, I think, to the level in which he could. And I think he kind of maybe saw that and was like, okay, well, let me just go to the NFL where I could just develop guys, where I can just, be a guy to just coach guys and I won't have to worry about recruiting. So what I do worry about, though, is the future of recruiting with the defensive backs position, because he was the main guy in recruiting DJ Pickett, and Miami, uh, you know, definitely wants the 5-star to be added to the 2025 roster. And I feel like he is going to be, a guy that will be missed in that regard. Of course, Miami is also recruiting Chris Ewald at the defensive back position. So, Frank, how does his departure really affect recruiting?
Oh, I think it's going to affect it on the short-term front with Onis Konanbanny, right? Like Onis Konanbanny had built a strong relationship with Jamil Addae. The foreign relationship that they have because of their, family adjustment to, the American life, was something that he talked about when we, had a discussion with him. I think that the relationship was starting to really build, and I think that he was nearing a commitment to the University of Miami. I did put him in a future cast for him to end up at Miami, and I think that I still feel confident about it. I think that the visit overall with the staff, was solid, not just with Addae, but I think that he was a major part of that recruitment. I think that things were moving in a positive direction with Ewald as well. I think that he was putting his best foot forward in communication, especially since his decommitment. Everything that I heard was that, that relationship was building, not just with Chris Ewald Jr., but with the family overall. There were multiple visits to campus for Ewald since his decommitment. And honestly, it was something where he started to become, the coach that they were hoping for from a relationship standpoint. So I think it's going to hurt in the short term just because there's going to be some unknown, I guess you could say, at that cornerback position until they hire somebody. And I think that cornerback position is one of those hot spots from a position coach standpoints that it's supposed to be a recruiter type position, right? Like you hear like the common names like Corey Raymond, like an elite recruiter. Pat Surtain is a hot name in recruiting, right? Like Steve Klinkscale, who was at Michigan, was a guy who was big in recruiting. Like those are just a few names. Like T-Rob, another guy who coaches cornerbacks. Like those guys are known as recruiters of the position, not just as developers. So I think for the short term, like top teams around the country that have really good defensive backs coach are going to kind of take advantage of Miami maybe in the next, few weeks, saying, oh, hey, you don't know what's going on there, right? Like you're walking into a little bit of an unknown situation with DB coach wise. But overall, I think that Mario Cristobal is going to do the right thing and hire the right guy at the position. And I'm sure we're going to go over the options in a little bit, but I think
I was gonna say, let's just go over those options that are out there, man. You got Chavis Jackson that's out there. You mentioned Pat Surtain, who could return home. I think that would be a perfect fit, reuniting with his old teammate, Jason Taylor, and just kind of returning to his old stomping grounds, being that he was the head coach of Powerhouse American Heritage. A couple of guys there that Miami is interested in. Brandon Harris, of course, if they want to go the long route, he's out there, and there's some other guys, that could be possibilities as well. Who do you think ends up getting this job?
I think Chavis Jackson is probably the hot name to talk about right now, just because of the relationship with defense coordinator Lance Guidry. He's a good coach. He's a young guy, 38 years old, has SEC experience. He's a former standout at LSU, coached at the Power 5 level at Kansas with Les Miles. Was a Nick Saban recruit, right? Won a national title at LSU. Like, I think that he's a good up-and-coming coach that would be a solid hire. A couple other guys that I think are strong candidates and would be interesting would be Nick Monroe. I think he's the co-defense coordinator right now at Minnesota. He's done an excellent job of recruiting South Florida during his time in college football. Was a defensive backs coach at Syracuse and was able to snag some guys out of the South Florida area, including from places like American Heritage and others, right? Like he, was always at St. Thomas Aquinas, right? Was a common face at Miami Central. Like he's known throughout the South Florida circles. And then obviously he's upped himself from a position standpoint now at Minnesota, and is still in the Power 5 ranks. So he's an interesting name to me just because I think he's a plus recruiter. And then the other name is Steve Clinkscale from Michigan. There's so much uncertainty at Michigan right now because of the Harbaugh situation, him leaving to go to the Chargers, that whole entire defensive staff basically leaving to go to the Chargers. I think that he's a guy that would be a home run hire just from a recruiting standpoint, an on-field development standpoint, and a transfer portal potential standpoint, right? Because there's going to be a spring window that opens up. And if you bring a Steve Clinkscale in, I think things open up, and not just at Michigan, but around the country in regards to guys wanting to come to the University of Miami. And I like what Miami has right now at the defensive back spot from a cornerback and safety perspective. But overall, you could add some guys. Like, what if Will Johnson wanted to come to the University of Miami, right? Would you turn that down, right, to add him with the Daryl Porter and have still two young guys underneath those two experienced players? And then, obviously, I think that would almost lock in Chris Ewald as a former Michigan commit, that had a strong relationship with Clinkscale as a guy who was committed for almost 2 years in the process to that coach. So and then before that, like, been at Cincinnati. I think he was at Tennessee before that. Like, he's been at a few different places where he's recruited South Florida heavily. Now he's a national champion. He comes in, he's experienced. He's an elite recruiter, one of the best in the country, regardless of position coach title. He's going to be expensive, but Miami, if they want to win a national title, you got to be able to spend with the big boys, and this would be a perfect opportunity for Mario Cristobal and obviously the boosters to come and swing a big stick and grab the best guy I think that's available.
Scared money don't make no money. We'll see how that works. Another name I kind of want to throw out there was Corey Parker, a cornerback coach at Toledo. I think he's done a really great job as of late, developing guys like Quinyon Mitchell, expected to be a NFL draft pick, and also familiar with South Florida guys like RJ Delancey and Chris McDonald. Also, Andre Fuller, who also is from Seminole Ridge, which is down here. So I think he could be a possibility as well. Toledo's defense intercepted like 12 passes in 2022. And they were like 10th when it comes to Pro Football Focus. I've got a full story on CanesCounty.com of 5 names to know for Miami's vacant defensive back coach job, which we, of course, will continue to monitor in the next couple of days. But also wanted to talk about Alonzo Highsmith. Just quickly, we could talk about that. Don't have to go really long on it, but he's a guy that kind of came in as the general manager to really kind of up the roster, which he helped to do for sure. But I always kind of heard from sources that he wasn't very involved in processes in this last year. He was kind of more so overseeing things and really not doing, I guess, as much as the other staff members, I guess, were doing as far as recruiting and putting together this roster. So I think he wanted another challenge. I think this guy is kind of more fit. His personality is more fit for the NFL. Definitely happy for him. Of course, he's an alum of the school. Great guy. Every time I had a chance to talk to him, always kept it real. But just your thoughts quickly on Alonzo Highsmith leaving for the New England Patriots.
It hurts because he's one of the best talent evaluators, whether that's college or pro, right? We know that he's had his hands on a few of the evaluations that ended up at the University of Miami from like a transfer portal perspective, JUCO perspective. Obviously, Colby Young was one of his, home run additions. He's at Georgia now, and they're excited about his potential. I think that you're 100% right, though. The NFL is his calling card. He's going with a guy that he knows from the Green Bay Packers. It's an opportunity for him to resurrect a team that's going to have draft capital probably over the next, high draft capital over the next 2 years. And he's going to be able to especially being in college football as of recent, knowing the landscape of what was, the best talent in college football over the last few seasons. I think he's going to go in and he's going to do an excellent job. I don't think it necessarily hurts Miami. I think that Mario Cristobal likes having guys that he knows around him. I think he likes having guys that have, experience and are proven talent evaluators, have that keen eye. And he was one of them. He was just a trusted asset to have around, somebody that, Mario could go to. And not just Mario, but, the athletic director as well. He put out a tweet saying how much an asset he has been during his time at the University of Miami. And we know around a year ago, they talked about how he was taking a little bit more of a role in the athletic program and not just football. But every time I was around the football program, it was him talking about kids. Like, he knew what was going on in the recruiting circles, right? Like, he might not have been the guy on the phones per se, but he had his finger on all the evaluations that this staff was pushing for. A lot of the, NFL projections that we're starting to see along the trenches, I think that he's been part of that growth on this roster. And listen, I think there's definitely going to be, it's definitely going to hurt, but there's a ton of really good talent evaluators in this roster. Dennis Smith is one of the best director of recruitings, I guess you could say, I think, in college football in general. Mario has his hands in the recruiting more than any head coach in college football, maybe. Overall, they're still going to be fine in regard to recruiting.
Totally agree. Happy for Highsmith to get that job, and happy for his contribution to the football program, really kind of upping the roster and really kind of setting the standard, I feel, going forward. Another tidbit of news that kind of came out, and I don't want to downplay it, but Matt Merritt has been reported to be the new running backs coach for Miami. Now, this is not official as of yet, but where there's smoke, there's usually fire. Matt Merritt was kind of, I guess, an odd name. It's not a name that I would say that most people had on their radar here. Just your thoughts, man, on Miami possibly going with Matt Merritt as the running backs coach, former running backs coach at USF.
Yeah, I think Miami tried to dip into the big pool, right, of running back coaches, going after some of the hot names, but those guys are pretty entrenched in a lot of the spots that they're at, right? Like, a Jawan Snyder is going to be hard to pull out of Penn State. They pay him heavily. I think he has a co-OC title, so it's not an easy thing to go grab, a Jawan Snyder or somebody of that caliber. So I think that they went and grabbed a young coach who's one of the best developers of talent from the FCS standpoint. If you go look at what he's done at places like Elon and James Madison when they were in the FCS ranks, he did a really good job at All-American caliber backs. And I think that if you look at what he did this past year with Naquan Wright, I think that he proved that he was able to get the best season out of a kid who was kind of under the radar at Florida for a long period of time. A guy we know from South Florida during his time at Carroll City, was a stud, was a one-time Miami-type prospect, but I think he's a good coach. I think the running back coach is one of those positions that it's kind of like tight ends in my opinion, right? Like, the running backs are going to come in, and if they're really talented, they're going to be good regardless of who the running backs coach is. It's going to be a position where it's going to be where a guy has to recruit well. He has to be young. He has to be able to build relationships. And obviously, Matt Merritt proved to the stat that he's capable of doing just that. He was part of a program rebuild this past year at USF where, Alex Golish, I think, is one of the best young coaches in college football, was able to get a kind of a hot start at USF, and Merritt was part of that process. So I think it's a solid hire. It's not great. It's not going to, make any huge headlines, but he's going to probably be solid overall. I think it's probably going to be a balance of what they've had in the last two coaches. I think Tim Harris was a home run hire. And I think that Kevin Smith was probably the biggest failure hire of Mario Cristobal's tenure so far. So I think it's probably going to be a balance of those two. And I don't think that there's going to be anything like super positive or super negative to come out of what's happening here.
I think the key for that hire is that he is or was an associate head coach and also the run game coordinator. I actually had the privilege to go to the Boca Bowl, and bruh, the longest game of my life, bruh. The longest game of my life, because USF runs a ton of plays. They run fast offense. So if he has anything to do with that, as far as the tempo of the offense, then I think it can only work into Miami's favor. I think at times Miami could have benefited from running a tempo type of offense. I think a lot of the times, I think they huddled maybe a little bit too much and couldn't catch the defense off guard a lot of times last season. So if he adds that element to the game, then yeah, I think it's a good hire. So we'll see, of course, if that indeed does come to fruition. We'll keep an eye on that as well. This week, Frank, we had National Signing Day. Miami finishes with the 5th ranked class, a top 5 class, like we predicted months ago would happen, that Miami would have a top 5 class. Last year, we had 3 freshmen that stood out on the field. You had a Francis Malinoa, you had a Ruben Bain, you had a Mark Fletcher. And you were right on Mark Fletcher. I do want to say that. I remember you were saying that he would end up being the starter by the end of the year. He indeed did end up being the starter. Unfortunately, he's going to be out for spring, of course. But when it comes to this season, when you look at this class, which 3 players do you think will be those type of impact players for Miami?
Yeah, Zaquan Patterson is the first one, and we spoke about him on the last show as a guy who I felt like was going to be an immediate impact guy in that freshman class. Jordan Lyle, I think he's going to be a guy that, with how the running back position is, where there's so many injuries and the potential for a freshman to come in and make an impact early on, i.e. Mark Fletcher, what he did last year, I think that he's going to be a guy, even if he's not a starter, he's going to be an impact player at the University of Miami. I think that he's probably the most balanced back on the roster almost already from a talent perspective. He is a really good receiver out of the backfield. We saw him utilized in the screen game in a major way at St. Thomas Aquinas. He had huge plays almost on a consistent basis. He has a low tread on the tires, never had over more than like 120 carries in a season at any point. There's a reason that he's a top 5 back ranked nationally by us here at Rivals. He's an elite player that they flipped from Ohio State. I think that he's going to come in and he's going to make an immediate impact, whether that's getting 5 touches or that's getting 12 touches in a game. He's going to be a guy that when he spells Mark Fletcher, right, he could be a guy that becomes the second best running back on the roster or a 1B to Mark Fletcher. I know A.J. Allen is really talented. I know that Henry Parrish is still there. I know that Chris Johnson is an explosive player. And Trevante Citizen at one point was considered a potential program-changing back when he was added in 2022. But Jordan Lyle is special. We've seen that over the last 2 years at St. Thomas, and him just kind of take over that offense, which has produced some of the best running backs we've ever seen come out of South Florida. And I think he's part of that mold. Another guy that I think is going to be an immediate impact player is Justin Scott. I think that there's a need at defensive tackle right now. You lose Leonard Taylor, right? I know Leonard Taylor didn't live up to the billing of being necessarily always the best defensive tackle in the ACC on a consistent basis, but he was definitely a high caliber player that is now going to potentially be a first round draft pick. And there's a reason for that. He was really good at the University of Miami when he was on the field. And I think that Justin Scott has the potential to be just what Leonard Taylor was as a true freshman. He's extremely talented. We've seen him be an absolute freak at the high school level, running the ball at times as a running back, which is almost unheard of when you're 310 pounds and 6'5". So he's a freak athlete that I think is going to begin as a rotational guy early on. But like I said about Mark Fletcher last year, I think he ends the year as a starter. Yeah. I love Ahmad Moten. I think that he's going to be a guy that's probably going to get the early reps. I love what they got out of the transfer portal, right? And Marley Cook and the kid out of NC State, but CJ Clark, right? But I think that you're probably looking at a combination of CJ Clark and Justin Scott as the starters by the end of 2024, because Justin Scott is just such a talented player. There's a reason that Miami continued to fight for him all the way through that process. He might be the most talented player that they added in this class, and that's saying a lot because you added 3 5-stars in this 2024 class. That's a top 5 class in the country. Justin Scott was a guy that hurt Ohio State when he decommitted, and he's special. He has first-round draft pick potential, and the fact that we're talking about him in this light is crazy because Josh Horton was the guy that we were talking about as a guy who could be a first-round draft pick just last cycle, and I'm already thinking that he could surpass him on the depth chart by mid-season. So it's going to be interesting to see, but I think those are my 3 guys just because of how talented that they are that are going to make huge impacts early on in their Hurricane careers.
Yeah, this defensive line is just absolutely loaded, man, and it's hard for me not to pick a defensive lineman that is going to make an immediate impact. And I'm just going to go with the 2 guys that really shined in the All-Star games. And that's Marquise Lightfoot, who earned his 5th star with Rivals, and also Booker Pickett. Like, I feel like these guys will be in the rotation as far as, being pass rushers or, even in first or second down roles, because you have a Reuben Bain, and then you have a Jaden Wayne, and you have Nigel Lee Kelly. But Jabari Harvey has now left the program, got a couple other guys who decided to leave. It's going to create competition, and I think those guys are going to be hungry to get on the field. And I could see, just like last year with Reuben Bain, I could see a Booker Pickett who really, I think, people really started to understand on a national scale how great he was in the past month. And I think the same goes for Marquise Lightfoot, who was dealing with an injury in his senior season. So I think those 2 guys could definitely make an immediate impact. I think those 2 guys do end up being rotational pieces on this defensive line. The last guy I will say is JoJo Trader, man. I'm hearing a lot of great things already about this guy. And obviously, this is a guy that has been outstanding in high school for years. Even before high school, he's been an outstanding player. But Rashard Smith is no longer with the program. So it really kind of leaves a void for that 4th wide receiver if we are assuming that Isaiah Horton is going to be that wide receiver 1. So there's going to be a battle for that 4th wide receiver spot, whether it be Ray, Robbie Washington, JoJo, or Nye Carr. And I wouldn't be surprised if JoJo starts to work his way into the rotation and starts to make noise, because this is a guy who has got tremendous ability, could play both ways if he wanted to. That's how much of an athlete he is. So I wouldn't be surprised if JoJo is the guy that we're talking about by the end of the year. Let's move on to the 2025 class quickly here. Miami's already got a jump start on that class with Waden Charles, who we all think is one of the best receivers down here in South Florida. Luke Nickel, definitely the MVP at Battle Miami, has been better than advertised, I would say. And then now we have also, let me talk about Elijah Melendez, who I heard from Coach Guidry himself that he was really high on this kid, calls him Baby Ray, as in Ray Lewis. So that's how highly he thinks about Elijah Melendez, who is an absolute beast. And now Lamar Williams, who was added to the class. I had a chance to talk to him as well on campus. And he, loved Miami, obviously decided to commit. And now where does this class go from here? Miami ends up with the 5th class here in 2024. If I would put an over under on it, and you could say, whatever you want on the players that we have already committed to the 2025 class, but over under for the 2025 class, Miami over 5, as in, do they get over a top ranked a 5th ranked class, or under a 5th ranked class for 2025?
Oh, I think Miami is going to be a perennial top 5 class team for the entirety of Mario Cristobal's tenure at the University of Miami. I think that he's probably the best, like I said, head coaching recruiter in college football, just his personal approach to how he does it. And so I think, there'll be a top 5 class, because I think Luke Nickel is going to make a huge jump up throughout the process. He was a state champion in Georgia, player of the year in Georgia, showed what, on a national scale at Battle Miami against top competition, helped win that tournament for Cam Newton's 7-on-7 team. He looked like he was more of from a size standpoint, the prototype at the position, and he's really, really good. I think he ends up as a top 10 quarterback from the pro style position. We know that they're probably going to add 1 or 2 elite backs. That's just what Mario Cristobal does. They just got a head start at the offensive line position by adding Lamar Williams. This was a 4-star offensive tackle. Elijah Melendez, already a top 2 linebacker in the country, could be a 5-star type player. Do you know that he benched 225 31 times? That is a ridiculous number for a high school junior.
There's some NFL players that can't do that.
Yes, there's NFL offensive linemen who can't do that, right? That is massive numbers for a high school junior. He is an absolute freak of nature, and I think that he's all in all a Cane. I know that he's posted some offers, and people have kind of got scared a little bit. I think he posted an Oregon offer or something like that, and there's starting to be some rumblings, but I'm not worried at all about Elijah Melendez. We got a chance to talk to him even before he committed, and he was all about Miami, and he has seemingly stayed that way through and through. I think that they end up with a top 5 class. I think that they're going to do a really good job. I think they're going to hit it out of the park at the defensive back position. Guys like C.J. Ewald, guys like Onis Conan-Banny, guys like Bryce Fitzgerald, guys like DJ Pickett, Jonte Gilbert. Those are all guys that could potentially end up in this class at defensive back, and that's huge, right? We've seen them kind of take single positions and focus on that from a major prospect standpoint, like the offensive line in 2023. This past one in the defensive line position. I think they did that with the receiver position this last class as well. Now they're going to do that with the defensive back spot, and I do think that they're going to do that at linebacker as well. If they're able to just round out this team at every single position group with major 4- and 5-star prospects, you're going to start to compete for major, college football, standings, right? This is how Georgia got to where they are. This is how Alabama got to where they are. This is how Ohio State got back into being a national power. This is how Michigan ended up, at the end with Jim Harbaugh doing what they did. They were grabbing the best players at positions, stacking talent, grabbing depth, and I think that they're going to do a really good job at the linebacker spot and the defensive back spot. Now, just kind of touching on Lamar Williams, this guy is 6'7", 280 pounds, former defensive lineman. He was super high on Miami when he got offered. Alex Maribel took a personal approach. When that went down, you grab this kid out of Florida State territory in the Panhandle. This is a kid that visited Florida State, that they did have, their hands on. They were recruiting him, and Miami won this battle. He is going to be a big-time prospect, in my opinion, as more eyes start to get on him. We already have him as a 4-star here at Rivals. I think that he could be an elite-level player, right? I think that they kind of took some guys that they were high on from an evaluation standpoint in the 2024 class, not so much 4-star caliber guys. Derek Plaz probably being, the most talented guy from a recruiting standpoint. This is a guy that I think is going to move up the rankings. Very similar to a Luke Nickel, just because you can't teach 6'7", 280-pound athletes at the offensive tackle position, and he is that. And a really good kid as well. Every time you talk to him, like soft-spoken kid. I love the addition. I love the addition. And late riser in the recruiting world. Like was a basic unknown up until like right before the season this year. As more and more people got eyes on him in the summer, those offers started coming out. I think that he's going to be a 20-plus offer guy by the end of his senior year, and Miami's going to have some competition to keep him in the class. So something to watch there. I do like where Miami's at with him. I think that he's rock solid to the University of Miami, very similar to Elijah Melendez, but there's going to be competition on that front to grab him on National Signing Day, early signing day next year, or this year in December, because he's extremely talented. He's a legit 6'7", 280, the real deal.
Yeah, definitely. Love what I see from him on tape. You can, of course, see our guy Steve-O break down the film of Lamar Williams on CanesCounty.com. And Miami snatched another player, like you said, from Florida State territory, just like they did last cycle with Artavius Jones committing to Miami. Miami does well when it comes to grabbing kids from Florida. 14 kids, prospects, ends up in the class for 2024. What do you think that number is? And 9 of them for South Florida. What do you think do you think that number stays like that for the 2025 class? Is it over or under those numbers?
I think it's probably going to be around the same. I think that majority of the receiving class is going to be from the state of Florida, just because there's so much talent at the position in 2025. Defensive back wise, right? Like if you consider a DJ Pickett, if you consider a CJ Ewald, that's 2 guys that, from the state of Florida. Running back wise, they're probably going to get 1 from the state of Florida. I think offensive line wise, you got Lamar Williams. You could probably grab 1 more throughout the state. I know that they're going after some guys, in the state of Florida, that are big-time offensive linemen, right? There's a guy out of Sumner. I think there's a guy out of Seminole that they're going to go after as well. Yeah, so overall, I think that they're going to hover around that 15 number for Florida prospects, just because there's just so much talent in 2025 in the state of Florida, as there usually is. But I think Miami's still going to add 25 to 30 guys in the recruiting rankings. There's going to be some attrition just over the course of Mario Cristobal's tenure, just because he is a tough coach. They're not going to wait around for guys to figure out what they are. I think that they're going to be tough in building this roster through and through. They're not going to wait on guys. You saw that with the 2022 prospects. Like, there are some guys that we thought could be studs, and they kind of just pushed them out of the building a little bit, right? Like, Cyrus Moss was the guy that we thought was going to be a big-time player, and ended up being someone that had to go a different direction because he just didn't come to fruition. So overall, I think that Miami is going to be around that 25-plus number in the 2025 cycle once again, and probably a good portion of that is going to come from homegrown prospects.
Last question here, just to compare the recruiting to the rivals. Miami ends up, like we said, with a top 5 class. FSU ends up 12th, and Florida ends up 15th. what jumps out to me is the fact that Florida State nearly made the playoff, bro. They nearly made the playoff. I mean, albeit they had a lot of contributions from transfers, but so did Miami. And for the future, though, does Miami continue to beat out Florida and Florida State in the Mario Cristobal era? Is this like done? Because it certainly feels that way right now, especially coming off a 7-6 season.
Oh, especially with Florida, absolutely. I think that this is the end of the road for that staff in Florida this year. They're probably going to go 4-8, 5-7, and that might be it for Billy Napier. So I don't foresee Florida making a huge jump like they did in the recruiting rankings early on last year, right? Like DJ Lagway kind of saved that 24 class from not absolutely cratering. But overall, I think that it's going to be always a lot of battles between Florida State and Miami. Jamie French is a perfect example of what that still is. Like Florida State, I think that they could be scary because Tramel Jones, I think, is very good as well. And he could make a rise up in the recruiting rankings, same as Luke Nickel did. And if he does, we know that if you have a top quarterback, it helps in building out your class, right? Like if you look at the other teams in the top 5 ranked nationally, Miami's really kind of an anomaly from the perspective where they didn't have a big-time quarterback prospect in this 2024 cycle. And they were still a top 5 team just because they added so many guys, like over 30 additions in the class, 3 5-stars, a number of 4-stars. Like that helped them get into the top 5. And I don't necessarily think they're going to add those numbers again. So Florida State and Miami are going to be on the same path, in my opinion, in 2025. They're going to get some huge hits. They're going to take some guys out of each other's territory. And I think that, they're both probably going to be around like that 7+ area. Florida State's going to do better in 2025 than they did in 2024. And as I think they start to move away from relying on transfer portal guys and starting to capitalize on the success that Mike Norvell's starting to have in Tallahassee. I know Canes fans probably aren't going to love to hear that, but he is a really good coach. And I think that he's going to do a better job in recruiting moving forward. He's gotten better. I know that 12, it probably isn't great from the perspective of almost making the playoff, but they missed on some huge guys. And if they were to get like a KJ Bolden, if they would have ended up getting a Zaquan Patterson, right? Like we're maybe talking about them where Miami is and Miami kind of being where Florida State is. So things could be flipped real quick. And I think that it's going to be close between Miami and Florida State probably in 2025, just because of the fact that Florida State's probably not going to go drastically down in the rankings this year. I think that even if they don't make it to the college football playoff, they'll probably hover around 10 wins just because Norvell is a good coach.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think Florida State is still going to be, kind of hovering around, and Miami will continue to battle with the Knowles for prospects. Florida seems to continue to plummet right now in the 2025 rankings. Miami ranked 16th. Florida State is 14th, while Florida is 26th. That's going to wrap it up for the Storm Tracker podcast. Remember to, of course, subscribe to the website if you haven't already. Use the promo code Miami30. And also subscribe to this YouTube channel live from Canes County. Also, make sure you follow us on all platforms for the Storm Tracker podcast. Until the next episode.